Hello there everyone, so good to see you. Fire Emblem Engage has been out for a while and boy do people have impressions. There's those who say this is the most disappointing Fire Emblem game they've ever touched, and those who say this is the best gameplay since Tetris. That's actually not possible. You cannot compete with the core simplicity of a masterpiece like Tetris. Although I probably would still S-rank support the I block. Just like any Fire Emblem character, they're strong, they're dependable, they're there when you need it, and just the sheer length. Engage has pulled in fans with a wide variety of experience with the franchise, from people who've only played 3 houses, those who've never touched a Fire Emblem before at all, and those who have played every title in the series. Sometimes opinions and bias from these players show a bit more than others, and the same goes for reviews. There was such a divide between people saying that the story was bland and the characters were okay, to others saying that the story was wonderful and the characters were amazing. Everyone kind of agreed that the gameplay was fantastic though. We can all at least agree on that front. But as for everything else, some people might need to calm down. Opinion Engage. So for context, I've played a Fire Emblem before with the Mards and the Roys. As such, my first impressions of the game in trailers were, wow, this is super colorful, it looks so clean and smooth like the animated cutscenes from Awakening, and they took a big turn in character design, didn't they? The trailer also started with a dip into the lore. That has to mean there's going to be a huge emphasis on that this time too, right? Well, as time went on, we ended up learning through previews and early impressions that the story isn't really anything to write home about, but the game played incredibly well. More than that, people were claiming that it played a little bit more like older Fire Emblem games, particularly between the Game Boy Advance and DS eras. And that was really exciting. I started with the Blazing Blade and I loved it as a kid. Played it again last year and I still love it now. There's this lovely balance of simplicity and depth going back to those games, and I still think they hold up very well. A bit more than the Binding Blade at least. Sorry, Roy. As I finally got into the game for myself, I got to play and see and feel many things. I think we'll just cover gameplay now because that seems to be the one thing that everyone universally can agree upon. It's great. On the surface, it's the same classic Fire Emblem formula that you're all used to, you know, and you love. Select your units, get in range of the enemy, attack until HP goes to 0. Defeat enemies, level up, get stronger, make smart use of the weapons you attack with. And it's as early as here that it starts to get interesting. In most Fire Emblem games, you have to consider which weapons to use against an opponent for an advantage. Swords beat axes, axes beat lances, lances beat swords. In previous games, using the advantageous weapon gives you a better hit percentage, an extra point or 2 of strength, things like that. Oh, but in this game, when you attack an axe user with a sword, for example, now you're causing a break to happen, which basically disarms them and leaves them open to attack from the next enemy. And if they happen to be targeted by a sword user after that round of battle that they're disarmed, it'll proc another break. This can also happen to you. If the main character Alear gets assaulted with lances, you're probably going to get a game over because they won't have a chance to really effectively defend themselves. Learning and making use of the weapon triangle has never been more important. And even beyond that, a brawler can disarm a tome or knife user in the same way. This might come as a shock to people who have come right off of playing 3 houses, since the weapon triangle basically didn't exist and bows were the bane of everyone's existence. If you've ignored the system in other titles, the game will make you learn in this one. And just look at these battles, they're so smooth, so clean and dynamic. I know we've been getting more and more detailed with battles as time goes on, but they're just so fun to watch this time around. Dodges will smoothly transition into attacks, and crit hits will have this really nice zoom in for effect. Some animations even vary with terrain. Like, units are actually in the forts now. I don't know how this horse got up here, but I don't care. When you disarm someone, you can see their weapon just scatter to the floor, and if you miss throwing a weapon like a lance or an arrow, it'll just sit there on the map, sad and unfulfilled. Units will explode through fences, and just the way they go flying when you hit them with an attack that takes off more than half of their health is, oh, it's just fun. People will talk about how over the top the normal and critical hit animations were in the Game Boy Advance era, and I feel like this is the closest we've ever come to that level of spectacle and sometimes outright absurdity. It gets anime as heck. The map design is also pretty stellar as far as I've seen. For the most part, maps are pretty small and condensed compared to others in the series. This is partly because the average movement range of your units are 4 or 5. It's small, but this makes every structure, obstacle, and piece of terrain feel intentional. Some maps will offer multiple routes for your units to tackle together, or even split off if you feel confident in your army. After a while, I felt as though I was doing the same maps over and over in 3 houses. Am I the only one who feels that? The Fog of War maps are also done in a unique way where you can't advance into the darkness blindly. You have to stop at the last space where you have light. This, by the way, exists because of the free roaming option you have when selecting units. You can't just blindly wander in the dark. You light torches and beacons, making your way through at a good pace. Despite this change, I never felt unfairly jumped by enemies in the dark that I couldn't handle, even at a harder difficulty. Another map staple of Fire Emblem are the desert maps, and you get a fair amount of those once you make it the Soulm. But instead of the terrain reducing the movement of all your units, there's specific tiles on the map that halt your advancement if you start to turn on one. You can work your way around and even bait your enemies into them. There's maps where they provide you a cannon to blast your enemies with fire, but you still need to use that strategically. There's even a chapter where the tide on the beach makes the water rise and fall, changing your movement without completely crippling your army. At least hopefully. You can even augment maps. Do not sleep on the obstruct staff. I cannot tell you how many times I felt like I was making a galaxy brain tactician move by correcting a stupid mistake I made by using obstruct to block off enemies. Something that kept catching me off guard was seeing the battlefield as a place you can explore after a chapter. It's a chance to talk to allies who have some unique dialogue, while also providing a nice cooldown after a rough fight. Throughout the game, the emblems have their own paralogs, most of which are recreations of a map from their own respective titles, and there's just something really surreal about walking around a map I played several times in the past, fully rendered and in HD. And oh yeah, emblems! That's kind of important to this title, right? As you progress, you'll get access to more and more protagonists from past Fire Emblem games to alter your stats and abilities. You can then choose to engage with a set character for 3 turns, giving you access to weapons that the corresponding hero used. Micaiah can give anyone access to light magic and staves, and heal your entire team for a relatively small price. Link can multiply herself, which you can use offensively or defensively. And Sigurd, if you see a spot on the map that you want to go, just ask the Holy Knight and he'll be like, say no more fam. They each have their own special, a signature move that can be used once after engaging, and you know, it's not as broken as I thought it would be. It pretty much replaces the battalions and gamut system from 3 houses, except you're able to recharge them from battle and also from spots on the map. Once you start getting more emblems and learning how to compound them off of each other with their own sets of skills, and some of which you can actually inherit for more optimization, you start to feel like a master tactician, and it just feels good.
You'll get no sympathy from me.
But it's not all about the battles, of course. Between battles, you're coexisting with your allies in Somniel, which pretty much replaces Garreg Monastery as your hub. Instead of talking with students and faculty between the long months leading up to story missions, your hub has been condensed into a much smaller location, which is a lot more like a resort for recreation. And this is certainly where some of the divide begins. So what even happens in Somniel? After every battle, you have the option of going here to restock items and weapons, equip skills and rings, harvest items for forging weapons, or making food, which by the way is also back. I don't think I can call it a Fire Emblem game anymore if I can't have pizza with my partners. You can train with allies or even emblems to increase your bond, which will unlock more skills and personal weapons to use. And then it gets more silly. You can exercise with these rhythm-like minigames to get temporary boosts for the next map. You can adopt animals too. Could you adopt a bunny in 3 houses? I'm looking forward to Brandon having a complete bun farm. There's fishing, fortune telling, online modes, costume changing, Panzer Dragoon, photo shoots, and Sami! Oh my god, Sami, what a precious loaf. After you feed and pet him a couple of times, Sami will proceed to follow you all over Somniel, and I just, look at him! Where can I find one of my own? You can't pet the dog in this game, but why would that matter when you can pet your guardian deity? Sami isn't any animal in particular. Sami is friend-shaped. This is also where you do a lot of social things too, like support conversations and just chatting with allies. Some allies have unique dialogue depending on where in the story you are, indicated by a blue ellipsis. Otherwise, they're just kind of lounging, relaxing, fishing, swimming, or what have you, all in their casual clothing. It's kind of nice to see Fire Emblem characters just chilling out like this for once. See, Somniel is a great balance between My Castle from Fire Emblem Fates and the Monastery from 3 Houses. My Castle is the bare minimum hub where you can run around, go to shops, talk to people, go to a spa. Nothing really stands out, you just visit and leave without needing to linger long. It's a largely forgettable area between chapters, so there's not much to go on here. Now, the thing about 3 Houses is the Garreg Monastery is a fantastic hub to explore. On the first playthrough. Going back to grind supports, finding lost items, and using your time meaningfully gets rather tiring on repeated runs, which is something the game directly promotes with its multiple paths. Even by the latter half of the time skip, I found myself trying to breeze through as fast as possible to get to the next chapter. The monastery itself, though, is such an integral part of the story. It's like borderline its own character with how much this place will play into the narrative, and it becomes more apparent the further you go. It's a tricky balance to accomplish, and I felt kinda bad to skip over this the further I got into 3 Houses. That might just speak to the kind of Fire Emblem player I am. I grew up going from chapter to chapter, learning about units through story beats, often watching a unit get introduced in a chapter, and then never spoken of again unless you do support conversations. The entirety of the Game Boy Advance era is guilty of this. Games prior to that era are guilty of this. I think Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn balance characters rather well with the use of the home base you visit after a chapter starts but before the battle begins that accomplishes what Garreg Mach, My Castle, or Somniel is, but just presented as a series of menus. An aspect I really miss, however, are base conversations, which pushes the story for a moment longer to speak to units who've just joined, getting insight on characters, hints on the next chapter, or just dumb fun moments of dialogue, because they can. But I never felt like we were compromising gameplay or story, despite how relatively bare bones the base is compared to modern Fire Emblem games. It was the perfect size, the perfect respite that bridged the gap between even the heaviest moments in the story. To be honest, the closest I felt to this was during the Scented Shadows DLC for Three Houses. The Abyss was like a quiet, intimate, and smaller version of the monastery, but there was less pressure to attend to all the social aspects that they expected you to do. Go to a few key points, talk to your party, ready your inventory, and you're off to the next chapter. It might be a much shorter campaign, but I really enjoyed those moments. It's here where I realize, even though I absolutely love the deep, richer stories the franchise has to offer, with its believable characters that have goals and ambitions, I found myself worn down when given not just the freedom, but the responsibility of doing all these little tasks that I had to run around and attend to. Somniel hits a good balance where everything is compact and not entirely necessary, treating it more like a resort to let characters relax. And that's fine, right? Your allies are allowed to relax in the middle of war? I know, it's an interesting narrative choice. And the characters of Engage. Oh, these characters. There's a rabbit hole to fall into here. After looking up several opinions about Fire Emblem Engage's story and characters, I've concluded that the only thing we can agree upon is that we all disagree with each other's opinions on Fire Emblem Engage's story and characters. And maybe I'm in the minority, but I adore these characters. They are colorful, they're quirky, they might be one note on the surface, but I can tell you they all have something else beneath them. Some just show it more blatantly than others. This cast is unhinged. They're kinda almost all crazy and loony in their own special way. The main character, Alir, might be the most sane character in this entire story. They are literally playing the straight man in a theater full of comedians. And you know what? That's fine. Listen, Three Houses gave us the most rich, lore-heavy story any Fire Emblem game ever gave us. And thus, with the option to choose one of three distinct paths, you pretty much intimately knew your team from start to end. With only sorta the exception of Fates, this is a vastly different structure from any other Fire Emblem game, and those who have only ever played Three Houses from start to finish might not realize that fact before diving into the rest of the series. Yes, every character has a specific trait that defines them. It's how we as the players recognize them, starting with the design, pose, and in recent titles, voice direction. Caspar loves to train, Hilda is lazy, Sylvain is a womanizer, Raphael loves food, you get it. But to those who have played Three Houses, you know that these characters have a lot more folds to them than you could imagine. They get thoroughly explored because these stories weave and revolve around them and their house, due to an extremely expansive and thought out world. Would we still love these students as much as we do if they were in the context of Engage, where you'd have to dig into support conversations to learn more about them? Engage gives a greater emphasis to portray characters having more or less one defining character trait. Because they will not be seen very often in the story, many of them have character traits exaggerated, sometimes to a grating degree. That can be a deliberate tactic used in a game that has a big cast like this. And it's a tactic that works, because at the end of the day, you'll find something you like more about certain characters than other people, and they'll find something that they like in one you might have benched throughout the game. Every single character in this game is someone's favorite. I'm not saying that Engage could have written a bigger story and that could have magically solved the whole problem with character depth. It's not like a great story and great characters are mutually exclusive either. Awakening has some incredibly beloved characters despite the story dropping them off a cliff and going on without them. Some more literally than others. Do we know much more about Tharja other than she's the hot goth hex girl obsessed with Robin? Do you recall other character traits about Owain that doesn't have to do with his crazy theatrics or his love of naming weapons? Probably not, but he's still best boy. Honestly, that's just how Fire Emblem has done it for so long. A game like New Mystery of the Emblem will give you unit after unit after unit. Some who just say a few lines and then just kinda sit there in your barracks, never to be seen again. Even my favorite games in the franchise, Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, do this. Elysia is a deep and complex character who pushes the story forward, eventually becoming a playable unit because she just doesn't want to sit around anymore. In the sequel, you follow her arc struggling to be a young queen before she's ready, constantly at odds with personal morals and political decisions. And yet, we'll talk about Mia more, probably because she's just one of the best units to use in the game. Her arc is wanting to become the best swordswoman as she works for Ike's team of mercenaries, and that's kind of it. I'm not even exaggerating, there's not much more than that. And yet, I still love her too! Path of Radiance is one of the best stories told in Fire Emblem, but she doesn't need to be deeply entrenched in the racial politics or royal hierarchy to be one of the most beloved characters in that game. So, what the heck happened since those days? We've met the narrative lows of Fire Emblem Fates and then recently all-time highs of Three Houses. That game is so ambitious with its story that the Warriors sequel, Three Hopes, gave us kind of more questions than answers in the lore. The thing is, if Three Houses didn't set such a standard for storytelling, Engage would not be getting scrutinized this heavily. I think the fact of the matter is, a lot of people who did previews, reviews, and many who had negative comments on the story and characters, they were probably expecting a different kind of game. Many of them might have gone in fully expecting and comparing it to Three Houses, which is perfectly understandable, but it hurt some of Engage's reputation before it even went out on store shelves. In reality, this story is on par with the vast majority of Fire Emblem titles. I'll put it out now, is it a generic story? Yeah! Contrasting with what we just played, it is for sure. But it's not like we haven't seen main character goes to kill evil dragon before this, you know? That's what Marth did, and that's the whole plot of Fire Emblem Awakening. Even the terminology the felled dragon was reused. But like, guys, this was supposed to be an anniversary title. If COVID hadn't stunted development of games, and therefore the release schedule of other games, I'm fairly certain this title would have been out way sooner. Just look at the trailer we saw mere months before the game came out. That game was done. It had to have been done. A title that has all these protagonists going on a journey to kill an evil dragon, it's one big homage to the roots of the franchise. And yes, they still could have added layers, they still could have made it super deep and dark with its story threads that all tie in crazy ways, but they didn't go that route. Personally, after the constant intensity of the story that was Three Houses, I think this was a good thing. It's something different, a different flavor to cleanse your palate with. The story, like previous Fire Emblem games, is a bit campy and predictable, but plenty enjoyable to play. And we're given just enough initial impressions of characters that people will naturally gravitate to some more than others. And that's just, oh, it's refreshing. Look, we don't always have to discuss if a character is a war criminal who should pay for her crimes. Sometimes we just need to go back and discuss who the hottest unit is. Maybe I just want a girl who will skewer my enemies just as much as she'll skewer a lizard and put it in a sandwich. My brain just needs something different right now, and the added emphasis of gameplay with Engage is feeding me that, and it's not a lizard sandwich. I'm just personally glad that there's no split paths. Good lord, split paths in these games made the community so toxic and it was just exhausting. There are still flaws, both mechanically and narratively, but I feel like the overall player enjoyment outweighs a lot of that. Although I'm still upset that I can't dress up Somniel in more accessories. Let me make them fabulous. As far as the story goes, it's fine to be disappointed with one in a game if it lets you down. It's fine if you find the cast insufferable and determine that, nah, this game isn't for me. It just felt like social media was shoving the agenda that Fire Emblem has lost its way with its explosively colored character designs and a 4Kids anime plot. Or that social aspects are ruined with no romance. I mean, support conversations still exist, just with no romancing that impacts the story in a major way, which What? People say they miss romancing in Three Houses? But where in the game did that make a difference? Were you hoping pairs would have babies like in Awakening, where it played an actual major role in the story? Or in Fates, where it was literally shoehorned in? Even in Three Houses, a romance S-rank support didn't happen until literally the end of the game. I think part of it shows where different generations of fans started with the series, and if that's important to you, then I feel you. There's bits of Fire Emblem's past games that never returned that make me sad as well. But Fire Emblem is still a strategy RPG game first, and just as with the original intention of supports, you still get the stat benefits from them. That's probably never going to go anywhere. But just between you and me, while it may not outright be romance for some characters, there's definitely more than a little intimacy to be found in the game if you dig around deep enough. Just saying, don't believe what everyone tells you, and you might be surprised with who grows attached to who. Honestly, the cast is more interesting than some give credit for. Most of the time, C-rank supports don't have a lot to bite into. When you meet somebody, you don't usually start waxing poetic about the meaning of life. But there's some B-rank supports and beyond that definitely dig a little deeper. In one support, Diamant will express his fears to Alir, and in another, Tamara will get him to sing with her, though it might be unfair to use them as an example, considering the narrative places a huge focus on the main heirs to nations. We see them change and fit into their roles as the game goes on. Ivy is genuinely one of the most interesting characters to follow as her story develops. But regardless, it's usually the characters the story doesn't focus on that deserve a look into. Selene and Alcris both talk about having nightmares about their brothers dying and the responsibilities and burdens they'd have to bear as the heirs to their kingdom, and it's both sad and sweet to see them relate like this. There's a lot more interactions that have more thought put into them, but I could go on all day about them. Not everyone will see the same supports through a given playthrough. It makes everyone's run unique, which is part of the appeal of older Fire Emblem games. I think it's a fascinating way to share your experiences with others, whether you're discussing it one-on-one or looking at a clip on social media. Kids these days have it so easy, man. Back in my day, we were only allowed to have 5 support conversations, which means we could only do 1 A rank per playthrough, and we'd have to grind them out by having units stand next to each other for dozens and dozens of turns. Man, we've come a long way. Where was this talk even going anymore? All in all, the story is unapologetic in the experience it's trying to deliver. It's self-aware, silly, much more lighthearted, bountiful with characters filled with color and charisma. Just because something is tropey doesn't mean it's bad, especially when it's so endearingly confident in what it is. We've all indulged in a TV show or anime that scratches that itch for us, and this is just that need that some people are looking for. When we finally get to the remake of Genealogy of the Holy War, I'll be even more thankful for this reprieve in storytelling, because, hoo boy, some of you are not ready for the story of that game. People were worried that the emblems would take over the story and give the main characters less time to shine. Well, update on that front, they don't. They don't speak much in the story, and here I was excited to see them converse with each other. It does happen, though rarely, despite it being mostly just a line or two. I do appreciate that the bond system has every character exchange some lines with each emblem, despite how short they are. As a longtime fan, it's fun to just see them banter. They each have a paralogue that reflects their own personal story, but it doesn't go too deep. And again, it doesn't need to. Fire Emblem Engage puts the gameplay first before the story, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a game that makes a strong attempt to cater to fans who have been with the series for 2, 10, 20 years or more. Whether or not it accomplishes that comes down to the kind of games that you enjoy and what experiences resonate with you. But what are your thoughts on Fire Emblem Engage as a whole? Are you satisfied with it? And if this wasn't your first Fire Emblem, where did you start in the series? Let us know down below, and be sure to like and subscribe to Good Vibes Gaming for more of our in-depth thoughts and other gaming related videos. You may want to ring that bell to be notified when one of us might start ranting like this, and even check out our Patreon, where just for $1 you can join our lovely little server on Discord. It's like our own personal little Somniel with our good friends, where you can tell us who your favorite Engage characters are, and why it's Yunaka, or Lapis, or Louis. Oh, it's beginning. It's starting. Let the wars begin. Till we meet again.